Hi and welcome to today's session. Today we are discussing the novel Catcher in the Rye. It is a popular and iconic work written by J.D. Salinger. He is an American writer. This work was published in 1951 and the novel was an immediate success, an instant success, and it has remained very popular with readers across ages and across cultures and traditions since then. And this novel was also significant in the sense that it was banned for a brief time from public schools, fearing that this may initiate some kind of untoward actions from the young teenage children. And this novel is also considered as the best kind of narrative about the coming of age of an adolescent boy. And there is a way in which we can situate this as a Bildungsroman, though this has a limited canvas compared to the Bildungsroman tradition that we are familiar with from the Western classical tradition. This is a work which has found immense appeal across the reading public in the world, and this is clearly seen as one of the most popular novels of the contemporary times of the 20th century. And even after these decades, even after these many decades which have passed between the publication of the novel and the contemporary, we find that there are a number of ways in which people try to engage with this work. It could be a scholarly approach, a critical approach. It could even be a response from an ordinary reader. So here we do not attempt to put Catcher in the Rye within any particular theoretical framework. The intention of this lecture, maybe in the course of a couple of lectures, to introduce this novel to you and discuss some of its salient features and possibly discuss some of its excerpts to be able to initiate an interest in you, and I hope you will be able to go back and read the novel in its original. This is a fairly slender volume, The Catcher in the Rye. To give you a sense of the language which is used in this work, I would begin by reading the opening lines. This is how the work begins. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you will probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. In the first place, that stuff bores me. And in the second place, my parents would have about 2 hemorrhages apiece. If I told you anything pretty personal about them, they're quite touchy about anything like that, especially my father. They're nice and all. I'm not saying that, but they're also touchy as hell. Besides, I'm not going to tell you my whole goddamn autobiography or anything. I'll just tell you about this madman stuff that happened to me around last Christmas, just before I got pretty run down and had to come out here and take it easy. I mean, that's all I told DB about, and he's my brother and all. He's in Hollywood. That isn't too far from this crummy place, and he comes over and visits me practically every weekend. He's going to drive me home when I go home next month maybe. He just got a Jaguar, one of those little English jobs that can do around 200 miles an hour. It cost him damn near $4,000. He's got a lot down now. He didn't used to. He used to be just a regular writer when he was home. He wrote this terrific book of short stories, The Secret Goldfish. In case you never heard of him, the best one in it was The Secret Goldfish. So this is how the narrative goes. And if you look at the language, it's far from literary, the kind of language that one would expect in a literary fiction. And I want to draw your attention to the kind of language which is used here before we get to further discussion. In The Art of Fiction by David Lodge, he uses this term scarce to talk about the language used in J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. So scarce is an appealing Russian word. As you would see David Lodge himself describing it, it suggests jazz and scat, as in scat singing, and this is how the term gets coined. And it is a first person narration. As you have seen, the entire narration is in first person, where the protagonist, Holden Caulfield, he narrates his entire story in the first person. And interestingly, if you've paid attention to the excerpt that I just read out to you, the reader is addressed as you. So it is a dialogue, it's an engagement between the writer and the reader. And there is a continuing engagement that the narrator is demanding from the reader. And this also contributes to the casual nature of the text, as if the writer is trying to have a private dialogue, a private confession with the reader. And the vocabulary used is very, very colloquial. There's nothing profound, there is nothing deliberate about the way the language is used. On the other hand, we find that we find the language of a teenage boy, a disturbed teenage boy rather, at work in this entire narration. And there's no, it would appear as if this is not a polished kind of writing, but it's also important to bear in mind that a lot of work has perhaps gone into retaining the rawness of this, in retaining the spontaneity of narration, in retaining the casual vocabulary which is used perhaps the same way in which Holden Caulfield would have narrated it had he been speaking to us, had he been delivering this orally. And as David Lodge himself puts it, needless to say, this is an illusion, the product of a much calculated effort and painstaking rewriting by the real author. A narrative style that faithfully imitated actual speech would be virtually unintelligible as are transcripts of recorded conversations. But it is an illusion that can create a powerful effect of authenticity and sincerity of truth telling. And this is the kind of craft that Lodge is drawing our attention to in this narration by J.D. Salinger. One also needs to situate this tradition of storytelling, this style of narration within a historical context, particularly within a literary historical context. This is an American text, and this is also a way in which the American writers perhaps could move away from the dominant traditions of England and Europe. And there is undoubtedly a way in which America inherited much of the literary traditions of England. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it also needs to be noted and appreciated that the American writers, the American literary tradition also moves away significantly from the English and European traditions. And this is one of the ways in which the narrative style is deliberately free, deliberately liberated from the inherited traditions. And this becomes easy to do when the narrator is also a child, rather an adolescent in this case. And Mark Twain in his Huckleberry Finn, he has already employed this technique. Like many others, Salinger also identifies a narrator who's fresh, who can also move away from the adult world in significant ways. And here David Lodge also draws our attention to the way in which he uses this technique in Huckleberry Finn. And here he talks about the adolescent boy whose vision of the adult world has a devastating freshness and honesty. This is something that we would begin to see in the narration of Holden Caulfield as well in Catcher in the Rye. And when Huckleberry Finn talks about different types of Christian faith, this is in Mark Twain's text, this is how he responds. Sometimes a widow would take me one side and talk about providence in a way to make her body's mouth water. But maybe next day Miss Watson would take hold and knock it all down again. I judged I could see there were two providences, and a poor chap would stand considerably sure with the widow's providence. But if Miss Watson's got him there wasn't no hope for him anymore. So David Lodge here makes this powerful point that J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield is a literary descendant of Huck Finn. And this is the way in which we need to locate the significance of this text, and also the kind of narrative style and also the kind of plot structure that Catcher in the Rye follows. We shall again come back to Lodge when we look at some of the other narrative techniques. But the one thing that I want you to keep in mind while we start reading the text is that this is a response from an adolescent boy's point of view against the phoniness, that's a term that he uses throughout, against the phoniness of the adult world. Here we find Holden Caulfield trying to save himself and the other younger children from the phoniness of the adult world by rescuing them, by not allowing them to grow up, he has this ideal view of the world that he wanted to save the children before they grow up. He wants to retain their innocence, retain their innocent identity forever. Of course, towards the end of the novel, he realizes that that's not a practical thing, and there's a way in which one needs to negotiate those various aspects of reality. But throughout the novel, we find this fight between Holden Caulfield and the world that he sees outside, which according to him is phony throughout. And throughout his experimentations with his education, with his friendships, with his sexuality, with his relationships, we find that he is constantly fighting with the adult world. And he also has this fierce protectiveness about his younger sister, whom he wants to protect from the adult world. And we will also see later about what this phrase catcher in the rye means and what the significance of this phrase is in the context of the novel. Before we get into the novel, we can quickly take a look at some of the fundamental themes which are explored throughout. There's a certain sense of universality that Catcher in the Rye also brings in. Of course, this is based in America. The context is public school education, but there's a kind of universality that the author manages to bring in, which we also see in the discussions of the major themes and motives. So, alienation is something that comes across as extremely significant right from the beginning. We get to know from the tone, from the attitude that Caulfield adopts, that he couldn't care less. There's a kind of cynicism that he has, and he feels alienated from the society, from his family, from everything around him. We realize that even the little bit of relation, even the little bit of connection that he has with friends or with his siblings, he finds it difficult to completely get attached to them. So he uses alienation as a form of self-protection. We find this getting worse in certain contexts, in certain situations, but at the same time we find that he also grows up in the process trying to deal with it, trying to negotiate with it. And this alienation is something that he uses as a mask to protect himself mostly against the mostly from the adult world, the phoniness of the adult world, from the expectations of the adult world, from the mockery and the many fake things which he associates with the adult world. And we find that he finds strength in being alienated from everything. He gets into trouble on account of that, but it also remains his strength in various ways, but at the same time it's also at the root of all his problems. And he finds this process of growing up very, very painful, and it is evident right from the beginning. When the story opens, we are being told about how he got thrown out of this prestigious public school and how painful an experience that was, dealing with his peers, going back home, facing the adult world and explaining to them what exactly got him into this. And it's not as if he's a terrible student throughout. We find him making an effort, but it's just that Caulfield does not seem to fit the bill when it comes to ticking the right boxes in an adult world. And this is, if we see this as a Bildungsroman, it's possible to see this work as a work which captures the process of a young character's growth into maturity, and this is indeed a painful process. And he's an unusual protagonist, one would say, because unlike the other kinds of Bildungsromans that we come across, where the central character, the protagonist, has a zest for life and also wants to experience life in its all eccentricity and in its all adventurous spirit, we find Holden Caulfield emerging as a protagonist who is resisting that process. He does not want to grow up. He wants to remain forever in the world that he is comfortable with. For the same reason, he's also most comfortable with his younger sister, Phoebe. And he is resisting the process, the growth towards maturity, and that makes him an unusual protagonist for a Bildungsroman. And it's in this context that I also want to talk about the significance of this title, Catcher in the Rye. Holden imagines childhood as this perfect, ideal state where children should remain forever. And this is, he also has this image of an very idyllic field of rye in which children romp and play, and he sees adulthood as a fall, as a fatal fall across the edge of a cliff. So he wants to be the catcher in the rye. There are children playing in the rye, in the field, they're having a good time, they are running about, and he thinks he wants to be the one who stands at the edge, and he wants to be the protector of all the children who are there with all their childhood innocence. He wants to retain them in that state and help them not to fall over. The falling over from this field over the edge of a cliff, that for him is very, very fatal, because that's also a fall into adulthood. So this is how this entire work is themed and structured. It's about a catcher in the rye who wants to protect the children before they fall into adulthood. But of course, at the end of towards the end of the novel, Holden Caulfield also realizes that it's not a realistic thing to do, that one needs to grow up and allow each other to grow up as well. And the other important theme is the phoniness of the adult world that Caulfield comes across. Phoniness is perhaps the most used term in this novel Catcher in the Rye, and it's also Holden's favorite concepts. It can mean multiple things in multiple contexts, as you would see when you begin to read the novel. It can describe a range of things like superficiality or hypocrisy or pretension, and mostly the shallowness that he encounters around the world that he sees, the adult world that he sees. And the complexity of the adult world, that's something that really bothers him, whether it is in terms of the expectations in school or the expectations at home or the various pitfalls in terms of relationships. He finds it unable to comprehend the complexity that the adult world is situated within. And coming to some of the motives, there are certain significant recurrent motives which we find throughout this novel. Some of the important ones are loneliness, about relationship, about intimacy and sexuality, which also brings in the innocence and the naivety in this character. And there's also a lot of lying and deception. And this is very, very interesting too, because Caulfield sometimes finds this compulsive need to lie. And at the same time, we also get it through the process of the narration that, and in this process, we also interestingly and very ironically get to know that even when Holden is lying, we do not seem to judge him. We do not seem to nurse any kind of ill feelings towards him. It only makes him more human. It only shows to the reader, as well as to Holden Caulfield, that he is also part of this adult world, because there's no way in which you can escape this lying and deception. It's also an inherent part of the world within which you are caught. There are some symbols and images that I would encourage you to be on the lookout for as you are reading this. And the most important one being Catcher in the Rye. There's a song coming through the rye which gets referred to. Then there's a reference to Holden's red hunting hat, the Museum of Natural History, the ducks in the Central Park Lagoon. Maybe in the following session we will also discuss the context within which these images and symbols appear, and the mummies that he sees in the museum, about death itself. And there's a lot of discussion about death, and it sometimes comes across as being very, very uncanny when Holden Caulfield, who is a young adolescent who's barely begun his life, when he talks about death, when he reminisces about death. And of course the Shirley Bean's record that he buys for his younger sister, and Phoebe's notebook, the obscene signs that he sees on the wall, which again, he feels is very, very harmful for the children. He wants to child-proof the entire world, if you may call it that way. He wants to make the world a safer place, a perfect childhood experience for all children. And this is what makes Holden Caulfield very, very endearing to us, in spite of the adventures that he goes through, in spite of the apparent complexity within which he is also rooted. And finally, towards the end of the novel, we find these three major symbols emerging, which is his younger sister Phoebe, the carousel in which she's playing, and the gold ring. And in these symbols and images, we also find the character getting fine-tuned into a mature person. And we find that there is a recurrent way in which these images and symbols, they continue to modify the story. They continue to define and redefine the story in multiple ways. Coming back to the narrative style, there are a number of slang expressions that we can find throughout this work. Expressions like jerk or bored as hell, phony, big deal, killed me, and old is also used as an epithet to refer to anything familiar, regardless of its age. And also certain exaggerated expressions such as smoking himself to death. You'd have thought they hadn't seen each other in 20 years, slobbering around. We also find a teenager at work here, a teenager using language the way he would with his peers. And we find that the syntax is kept fairly simple. There are no complex, complicated sentences, no profound ideas. But at the same time, the overall effect is indeed very, very profound. We shall later take a look at some of the important critiques that this novel places in terms of critiquing the public school system of education, in terms of engaging with the expectations of education, which also follows a certain kind of a formula. We find how certain brilliant minds, for instance, one cannot dismiss Holden Caulfield as a dumb student, but he fails to fit within a framework. And these are some of the critiques that the novel also raises. And the sentences mostly are very short and uncomplicated, and some sentences are not even properly formed, as you would see. And the discourse is very, very informal throughout. And this also speaks volumes about the spontaneity and the authenticity of this narration. We tend to take Holden Caulfield most seriously, mostly on account of this spontaneous, authentic narration. One would still have no way of knowing whether he's telling the truth or not, because he also tells us about the various instances where he lied, sometimes for no reason. Regardless of that, there's an honesty which comes through. At least Holden Caulfield is presenting to us the self that the reader wants to know, that he would ideally want the reader to know. And this is extremely important given that he is a teenage boy. There are a range of expectations within which he is working. There's an anxiety of performance, and he also wants to present his best self. That's evident throughout. And the painstaking way in which the author presents this teenage boy's confusions and struggles, that's certainly praiseworthy. And this is something that he reaches mostly on account of the kind of language that is used. We find language, the form in which this work is presented, getting a lot of attention here. So as we begin to wrap this lecture, I also want to draw your attention to the significance of the language used here, the form in which this is presented, more than the kind of ideas that this novel tries to get across. I'm not saying that the ideas are not important, but more than that, at various levels, what plays a significant role here is the mode of narration, the narrative technique, the language used, which is closer to an adolescent world, which also becomes more powerful, which also becomes more effective when the critique is also launched from that space which the adolescent boy inhabits. The critique against public system of education, the critique against the overt and sometimes unreasonable expectations of the adult world, and how an innocent, helpless boy tries to fight these complications all by himself. The helplessness that he feels, though technically speaking, he has a family, he has siblings, he has a system of education within which he is also placed. The helplessness that he feels and what insanity that it drives him through, those are some of the points that would make sense, that would make perfect sense, I would say, only when this is voiced from the through the language that the adolescent boy uses. And throughout the story, there's an episodic nature to it. It's a linear narrative, but there are certain episodes. There's a jump from one episode to the other. And this makes, and also a lot of trivial instances are discussed, as David Lodge also points out. And in his words, the language is, by normal literary criteria, very impoverished. Salinger, the invisible ventriloquist who speaks to us through Holden, must say everything he has to say about life and death and ultimate values within the limitations of a 17-year-old New Yorker's argot, eschewing poetic metaphors, periodic cadences, fine writing of any kind. Herein lies the true challenge of this writing, I would say. When you get familiar with the novel, you would also begin to see a hang of get this point across, what David Lodge is trying to make here, that this is fine writing achieved in a very different way. This is eloquence achieved without really using an eloquent language, an impoverished language, as he would say. And what this impoverished language seems to achieve, seems to access, is perhaps the true test of genius and the true test of the supreme craftsmanship that Salinger also has. So when we come back to discuss this novel in the next session, I hope you'll be more familiar with the text, with the plot, and also with at least some excerpts from this novel. And we shall continue to take a look at some of the significant episodes and also how that validates certain points that Holden Caulfield seems to stand for, and also how such a kind of writing, which seems very, very personal and private, but at the same time it has the power to initiate discussions about larger macro things, about larger systems such as an institution, such as a system of education itself. So with that note, we wrap up today's session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.